Garrett Blackwood lowered his binoculars and smiled. Down in the valley, another foundation was being poured, the 60th one. For 3 months, he had watched from this ridge as crews swarmed over his land like ants, building their luxury cabins without a single permit bearing his signature. Everyone in Copper Ridge thought he had lost his mind, maybe his spine too. But Garrett knew something they didn't, something that made every hammer blow, every bulldozer track, every dollar they spent work in his favor. The joke was on them. They just hadn't figured out the punchline yet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Garrett packed his binoculars into his worn leather satchel. 3 months ago, Marcus Steinberg and his Phoenix Development Company had rolled into Copper Ridge with their fancy trucks and expensive suits, claiming they had purchased this land fair and square. The problem was, Garrett had never sold it. His grandfather had left him these 800 acres in 1987, and every tax payment, every legal document, every survey marker proved it belonged to him. But instead of calling the sheriff or hiring lawyers immediately, Garrett had done something unexpected. He had watched, and waited, and documented everything. Elena Vasquez had thought he was crazy when he first walked into her law office in Flagstaff. A property attorney who specialized in land disputes, she had seen plenty of cases where developers tried to bully small landowners into selling. But she had never seen someone like Garrett, who seemed almost happy about the invasion. "You understand they're trespassing, right?" she had asked during their first meeting. "Every day they continue building is another day of documented illegal activity." Garrett had just smiled that same smile he wore now. "I understand perfectly. How much do you think 60 luxury cabins are worth, Elena?" She had run the numbers. With materials, labor, and the high-end finishes Steinberg's company was known for, each cabin represented at least $200,000 in construction costs. Multiply that by 60, and they were looking at $12 million in improvements being built on stolen land. "But there's something else," Garrett had told her. "Something that makes this even better." The Arizona heat was already building as Garrett made his way down the ridge toward his pickup truck. In his back pocket, his phone buzzed with another text from his neighbor, asking if he had finally lost his mind. The whole town was talking. Garrett Blackwood, the quiet rancher who had kept to himself since his wife died 5 years ago, was letting city developers destroy his family land. What they didn't know was that Garrett had spent those 5 years studying property law, learning about adverse possession, trespassing statutes, and something called unjust enrichment. What they didn't know was that every single cabin being built was making his case stronger. As he reached his truck, Garrett glanced back at the construction site one more time. The workers were already pouring concrete for Foundation 61. He chuckled softly and climbed into his cab. By the time Marcus Steinberg realized what was happening, it would be far too late to stop it. Marcus Steinberg adjusted his gold watch and surveyed the construction site with satisfaction. 60 cabins nearly completed, each one a masterpiece of modern rustic design that would sell for $800,000 minimum. The Desert Vista Resort was going to be his crowning achievement, the project that would finally put Steinberg development on the map, with the big players in Phoenix and Scottsdale. The fact that some old rancher was watching from the hills didn't concern him. Marcus had done his homework. Garrett Blackwood was a widowed nobody who hadn't fought back in 3 months. That kind of weakness told Marcus everything he needed to know about the man's character. "Mr. Steinberg?" His site manager, Jake Rodriguez, approached with a clipboard full of inspection reports. "The electrical crews are asking about the final hookups. They want to know when we're planning the grand opening." Marcus lit a cigar and blew smoke into the dry Arizona air. "Tell them Christmas. I want families booking these cabins for the holidays. Premium rates." What Marcus didn't mention was the legal situation. His lawyers had assured him the land purchase was legitimate, but there had been some complications with the paperwork. Nothing serious, they said. Just bureaucratic delays that happened all the time in rural counties. The previous owner had died intestate, and the land had been tied up in probate for years before being auctioned off for unpaid taxes. At least, that was the story his Phoenix legal team had sold him. The truth was more complicated. Marcus had known from the beginning that Garrett Blackwood claimed ownership of the land. But Marcus had also known something else. Small-town ranchers rarely had the resources or knowledge to fight corporate developers in court. They usually folded when faced with expensive legal battles they couldn't afford. Except Garrett wasn't folding. He wasn't even fighting. That should have been Marcus's first warning sign. "There's something else, sir," Jake said, lowering his voice. "The old man was here again this morning. Same routine. Parks on the ridge. Watches us work for about an hour, then leaves. Some of the guys are starting to feel uncomfortable." Marcus laughed. "Let him watch. Maybe he'll learn something about how real business gets done." But as Marcus walked between the nearly completed cabins, admiring the stone facades and custom timber work, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Why wasn't Blackwood causing trouble? In Marcus's experience, property disputes were messy, emotional affairs. Owners screamed, threatened lawsuits, called the media. They didn't just watch silently while millions of dollars in construction happened on their alleged land. Unless they knew something he didn't. Marcus pulled out his phone and speed-dialed his head attorney in Phoenix. "Tom, it's Marcus. I need you to double-check that Copper Ridge property acquisition one more time." "Marcus, we've been through this. The land was legally purchased through the county auction. All the paperwork is—" "I don't care about the paperwork. I want you to personally verify that Garrett Blackwood has no legitimate claim to this property. And I want it done today." There was a pause on the other end. "Is there a specific reason you're concerned?" Marcus watched a concrete truck rumble past, heading toward the site where Cabin 61 was taking shape. "Call it intuition. Something doesn't feel right about this." As he ended the call, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the ridge where Garrett usually parked, sunlight was reflecting off something metallic. Binoculars. Or maybe a camera lens. For the first time in 3 months, Marcus Steinberg wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Elena Vasquez spread the photographs across her mahogany desk like a dealer shuffling cards. 3 months of documentation lay before her in crisp digital prints. Every angle of every cabin, every piece of heavy machinery, every truck that had crossed onto Garrett's land without permission. The evidence was overwhelming, but what made her smile was something else entirely. "You've been busy," she said, as Garrett settled into the leather chair across from her desk. "Not as busy as they have." Garrett pointed to a photograph showing Marcus Steinberg shaking hands with a county inspector. "That was taken yesterday. They're getting ready for final inspections." Elena picked up a thick manila folder and opened it to reveal a stack of legal documents. "I've been busy too. Your grandfather was very thorough when he filed the original land patents. Every boundary marker, every survey stake, every legal description matches perfectly with current county records. There's no question about ownership. But that wasn't the best part. Elena had discovered something that would make Marcus Steinberg's expensive legal team very nervous. When Garrett's grandfather had purchased the land in 1952, he had also secured something called mineral rights retention. Not just surface ownership, but everything below ground as well. "Garrett, did your grandfather ever mention anything about what might be under this land?" "Water," Garrett replied without hesitation. "Grandfather always said this land sat on top of one of the largest aquifers in northern Arizona. Back then, water rights weren't as valuable as they are now." Elena felt her pulse quicken. Arizona water rights in 2024 were worth millions. With climate change and ongoing drought conditions, groundwater access was more valuable than gold. Marcus Steinberg wasn't just building on stolen land. He was building on top of a fortune. "There's something else you need to know," Elena continued. "I did some research on Steinberg development. This isn't their first questionable land acquisition. They've been sued twice in the past 5 years for similar tactics. Both cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts." Garrett's expression darkened. "So this is their business model. Find vulnerable landowners and steal their property." "It appears so, but here's where it gets interesting. In both previous cases, construction had barely begun when the legal challenges started. They've never let a project get this far along before facing serious opposition." Elena pulled out her laptop and showed Garrett a spreadsheet. "Based on current construction costs and the level of finishing I can see in these photos, Steinberg has invested approximately $14 million in materials and labor. Add in the heavy machinery, permits, and site preparation, and we're looking at close to $16 million total." The numbers were staggering. Garrett had known the project was expensive, but seeing it calculated precisely made the magnitude clear. Marcus Steinberg had bet everything on this land being his to develop. "So what happens now?" Garrett asked. Elena closed the laptop and looked directly at him. "Now we spring the trap. But there's one more thing we need to discuss first, something that will determine just how much justice costs." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out another document. One that would change everything about this case. "Garrett, Have you ever heard of punitive damages? Tom Morrison hung up the phone and stared at his computer screen in horror. As Marcus Steinberg's head attorney, he had just spent 4 hours diving deep into the Copper Ridge property records. What he found made his stomach turn cold. Garrett Blackwood's ownership was ironclad. Not only did he possess clear title to the land, but every tax payment for the past 37 years had been made on time. Every legal document was properly filed. There had never been a probate case, never been a tax auction, and certainly never been a legitimate sale to Steinberg Development. Someone in his firm had fabricated the entire acquisition story. Tom reached for his phone to call Marcus, then stopped. This wasn't a conversation for phone calls. This was the kind of news that required a face-to-face meeting and probably a very expensive bottle of whiskey. Meanwhile, at the construction site, Marcus was dealing with a different kind of problem. Jake Rodriguez had just informed him that someone had been asking questions in town. Not just casual questions, but the kind of detailed inquiries that suggested serious legal preparation. "Who's asking?" Marcus demanded. "Some lawyer from Flagstaff. Elena something. She's been talking to the county clerk, the surveyor's office, even the historical society. Word is she's building some kind of case." Marcus felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the desert air. What kind of case? Nobody knows for sure, but she's been asking about water rights, mineral rights, and something called adverse possession. Whatever that means. Marcus knew exactly what it meant. Adverse possession was a legal concept that could force someone to give up land they had illegally occupied. But it typically required years of occupation, not months, unless there were other factors involved. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom Morrison. "Emergency meeting. My office. Now." The drive to Phoenix took Marcus 2 hours, but it felt like 2 days. Every mile brought new scenarios racing through his mind, each one worse than the last. By the time he reached Tom's downtown office, Marcus had already started calculating how much money he could lose if this project fell apart. Tom didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Marcus, we have a serious problem. The Copper Ridge land acquisition was fraudulent. Garrett Blackwood never sold that property. In fact, he's owned it clear and free for decades." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Your firm handled the purchase. You showed me all the documentation." "Fake documentation. Someone in my firm created false records to make the sale appear legitimate. I'm still investigating who and why, but that doesn't change the current situation." Marcus slumped into a chair. "How bad is this?" Tom pulled out a legal pad covered in notes. "Catastrophic. We're looking at criminal trespassing, theft of services, unjust enrichment, and possibly racketeering charges. But that's not even the worst part. What could be worse than criminal charges? The water rights. Garrett Blackwood doesn't just own the surface land. He owns exclusive rights to the largest underground aquifer in northern Arizona. In today's market, those rights alone are worth $50 million. The room spun around Marcus. $50 million in water rights, plus $14 million in improvements he had built on stolen land. He was facing the largest financial disaster in his company's history. "There's one more thing," Tom continued. "Elena Vasquez, the attorney representing Blackwood, specializes in cases exactly like this. She's never lost a property rights case in 15 years of practice." Marcus stared out the window at the Phoenix skyline, watching his empire crumble in his mind. "Tom, what are my options? Honestly, start praying that Garrett Blackwood is feeling generous." Garrett folded the legal documents Elena had prepared and slipped them into his jacket pocket. Outside her Flagstaff office window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Tomorrow morning, these papers would be served to Marcus Steinberg, and 3 months of patient waiting would finally pay off. "You understand what happens next?" Elena asked, walking him to the door. That familiar smile crossed Garrett's weathered face. "Marcus finds out that every dollar he spent made my case stronger. The more he invested, the bigger the compensation I'm entitled to receive." Elena nodded approvingly. "Exactly. In Arizona, unjust enrichment cases like this one can result in the plaintiff receiving not just the fair market value of the improvements, but punitive damages for intentional trespassing. We're not just talking about getting your land back, Garrett. We're talking about getting paid for every cabin they built." The drive back to Copper Ridge gave Garrett time to think about justice. Not the quick, hot-tempered kind that might have led him to confront the developers on day one, but the cold, calculated kind that comes from understanding exactly how the system works and using it to your advantage. His grandfather had taught him that patience was a weapon. Never strike when you're angry, boy. Strike when you're prepared. Garrett had been preparing for 3 months. As his pickup truck crested the hill overlooking his property, Garrett could see the construction crews wrapping up their workday. 60 completed cabins dotted the valley like expensive chess pieces, each one representing another $200,000 in Marcus Steinberg's investment. Tomorrow, those chess pieces would become evidence in a legal battle that Marcus couldn't win. The irony wasn't lost on Garrett. Marcus had chosen this property precisely because it seemed like an easy target. A lonely widower with no apparent legal representation, no corporate backing, and no obvious means to fight back against a well-funded development company. What Marcus hadn't counted on was that Garrett's late wife had been a paralegal, and she had spent their 23 years of marriage teaching her husband everything she knew about property law. Sarah would have loved this moment. She had always said that bullies only understand one language. Overwhelming force applied at exactly the right time. Garrett parked his truck at his usual spot on the ridge and pulled out his binoculars for one last look at the construction site. Tomorrow, there would be no need for surveillance. Tomorrow, the tables would turn completely. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. Papers filed. Process server will be at the construction site at 8 a.m. sharp. Are you ready for this? Garrett typed back his response. I've been ready for 3 months. As he lowered his binoculars, Garrett noticed something that made him chuckle. Marcus Steinberg was standing in the center of the site, gesturing animatedly while talking on his phone, probably trying to figure out his next move now that his lawyer had delivered the bad news. But there would be no next move, not for Marcus. Tomorrow morning, when that process server handed him the lawsuit papers, Marcus Steinberg would discover that he had built his empire on sand, and Garrett Blackwood would finally collect the debt that patience had earned him. Marcus Steinberg was reviewing architectural plans when the process server found him. The man appeared out of nowhere, walking purposefully between the completed cabins with a manila envelope in his hand and a badge hanging from his shirt pocket. Marcus Steinberg? That's me. You've been served. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as Marcus tore it open. The first page made his hands shake. Blackwood versus Steinberg Development Corporation and Marcus Steinberg, individually. The second page made his knees weak. Complaint for trespassing, unjust enrichment, conversion of property, and punitive damages. But it was page 3 that made Marcus sink onto a stack of lumber like a man who had just been shot. The demand, $67 million. Jake Rodriguez noticed his boss's face turn pale and walked over. Mr. Steinberg, everything okay? Marcus couldn't speak. The lawsuit laid out Garrett Blackwood's case in devastating detail. Clear title to the property dating back to 1952. 37 years of continuous tax payments. Water rights worth $50 million. And most damaging of all, documented evidence that Steinberg Development had knowingly built on property they did not own. The legal complaint included photographs. Dozens of them. Every stage of construction, every piece of equipment, every truck that had crossed onto Blackwood's land without permission. 3 months of careful documentation that proved intentional, willful trespassing. Get me Tom Morrison on the phone, Marcus managed to whisper. Right now. Right now. While Jake made the call, Marcus read through Elena Vasquez's legal argument. Under Arizona law, a property owner was entitled to the full value of improvements made on their land without permission. That covered the $14 million in construction costs. The water rights added another $50 million. But the punitive damages request was what would destroy him completely. The lawsuit argued that Steinberg Development had engaged in a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition designed to steal property from vulnerable owners. It cited the 2 previous cases that had been settled out of court. It mentioned fake documentation and criminal conspiracy. It requested punitive damages equal to 3 times the actual harm, which brought the total demand to $67 million. Marcus's net worth was approximately $20 million. When Tom Morrison answered Jake's call, his voice sounded defeated before he even heard the problem. Marcus, please tell me you're calling about something other than the Blackwood situation. They served me. Tom, $67 million. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Tom spoke. Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully. Do not make any statements to anyone. Do not contact Blackwood or his attorney. Do not remove any equipment from that property, and whatever you do, do not destroy any documents related to this project. Why? What are you saying? I'm saying this has moved beyond a civil lawsuit. The FBI is now investigating the fraudulent documentation in your land acquisition. If they find evidence of a criminal conspiracy, you could be looking at federal charges. Marcus dropped the phone. Standing on his ridge, Garrett Blackwood lowered his binoculars and smiled that knowing smile one more time. 2 weeks after being served, Marcus Steinberg sat across from Elena Vasquez in a sterile conference room at the Flagstaff courthouse. His legal team had shrunk from 5 attorneys to 1, and his confidence had evaporated completely. The FBI investigation was moving forward, and every day brought new evidence of fraudulent documentation that his own firm had created. My client is prepared to offer a settlement, Marcus's remaining attorney announced. Elena didn't even look up from her notes. I'm listening. Full transfer of the completed structures to Mr. Blackwood, plus $2 million in cash compensation. Garrett, sitting quietly beside Elena, let out a soft chuckle. It was the same sound he had made while watching through his binoculars for 3 months. Absolutely not, Elena replied firmly. Your client built 60 luxury cabins on stolen land while knowing he had no legal right to do so. The fair market value of those improvements is $14 million. Add the water rights violation, and we're discussing $50 million in actual damages. Our punitive damage claim of $67 million stands. Marcus leaned forward desperately. Mr. Blackwood, please be reasonable. I made a mistake. My legal team misled me about the property acquisition. I never intended to steal your land. For the first time in the meeting, Garrett spoke. His voice was calm and measured. Mr. Steinberg, you've done this before, twice. Your business model depends on finding people like me and betting that we won't fight back. The only mistake you made was picking the wrong target. But $67 million will destroy my company completely. That's the point. Elena spread several documents across the conference table. Mr. Steinberg, the evidence shows that you researched my client extensively before beginning construction. You knew he was a widower living alone. You knew he had no obvious legal representation. You believed he would be too intimidated or too poor to challenge you in court. That was your fatal error in judgment. The documents included screenshots of social media searches, property tax records, and demographic reports that Steinberg Development had compiled about Garrett before starting construction. They had profiled him like a military target, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. We have bank records showing your company has a separate account specifically designated for legal settlement payments, Elena continued. You budget for getting caught, Mr. Steinberg. This isn't accidental trespassing. This is calculated theft disguised as real estate development. Marcus's attorney tried one last desperate approach. What if we transferred the entire completed resort to Mr. Blackwood immediately, plus $10 million in cash? Garrett stood up from his chair. Counselor, your client is trying to negotiate with money that he stole from me. Those cabins were built with materials purchased using profits from previous illegal land grabs. That water he's been pumping for his construction comes from my aquifer. Even the roads he built to access the site cross my property without permission. He walked to the conference room window and looked out toward the mountains in the distance. I spent 3 months watching your client destroy my family's land because I wanted to make absolutely certain that when justice came, it would be complete and final. There will be no settlement, no negotiation, and no mercy. When Garrett turned back toward the table, Marcus saw something in the old rancher's eyes that made him understand completely. He was looking at a man who had already won. 6 months later, Garrett Blackwood stood in the doorway of cabin number 37 and smiled. The same smile he had worn while watching Marcus Steinberg's crews build these structures on his stolen land. Except now, every single cabin belonged to him legally and completely. The final court judgment had been even better than Elena had predicted. Judge Patricia Chen had awarded Garrett not just the $67 million in damages, but also complete ownership of every structure, road, and improvement that Steinberg Development had built. Marcus's company was ordered to transfer all completed work to Garrett immediately, without any compensation whatsoever. It's called unjust enrichment, Elena had explained after the ruling. When someone builds on your property without permission, you get to keep the improvements. The court ruled that since Marcus knew he was trespassing, he has no right to any compensation for his construction costs. Marcus Steinberg had declared bankruptcy within a week. His development company was dissolved, his assets were liquidated, and he personally faced federal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud. The FBI investigation had uncovered a pattern of illegal land acquisitions going back 8 years. Marcus would likely spend the next decade in federal prison. But for Garrett, justice was about more than punishment. It was about restoration. The Desert Vista Resort, as Marcus had planned to call it, was now officially the Sarah Blackwood Memorial Lodge, named after Garrett's late wife. Instead of an exclusive retreat for wealthy tourists, Garrett had partnered with the Arizona Department of Veterans Affairs to convert the property into a therapeutic retreat for military veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress. The 60 luxury cabins that Marcus had built with stolen profits now provided free housing for veterans who needed time and space to heal. The community center that was supposed to host expensive corporate events now offered counseling services and job training programs. The swimming pool and recreational facilities served people who had served their country. Garrett walked through the property every morning, checking on his guests and maintaining the grounds. At 73 years old, he had found a new purpose. The land his grandfather had left him was finally being used the way it was meant to be used, to help people. On the ridge where he used to watch through binoculars, Garrett had installed a small memorial bench dedicated to Sarah's memory. Every evening he sat there and looked down at the cabins filled with veterans finding their way back to civilian life. Marcus Steinberg had thought he was stealing from a powerless old man. Instead, he had unknowingly funded the most important project of Garrett Blackwood's life. Sometimes patience wasn't just about waiting for justice. Sometimes patience was about waiting for the chance to do something meaningful with the justice you received. The developers had built 60 cabins on his land. He had let them finish. Then he had taken it all back and turned it into something beautiful. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and determination triumph over those who abuse their power. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.